Hello, I'm Hazem Sika. This is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your weekly look at the world of business and finance. This week, trading places.
On trade, I am going to issue our notification of intent to withdraw from the Trans-Pacific Partnership.
As America backs away from closer global economic integration, we'll ask if China has what it takes to be the world's new champion of free trade. Also this week, the UK's JAM families. It stands for Just About Managing. We'll ask if the first budget after Brexit is going to help them.
I'm Andrew Thomas in a shoe factory in Adelaide. I'll be explaining why Australia's government is coming under pressure to protect manufacturing companies like this.
Well, this week saw a big shake-up in the world of international trade relations. Why? Because of a big free trade deal that took years to put together may soon be breathing its last breath, the Trans-Pacific Trade Partnership. This was the largest ever U.S. proposed trade deal, and President-elect Donald Trump has vowed to withdraw from it on his very first day on the job. But what does it mean when the world's biggest economy and the champion of free trade for the past century decides to take a step back? It leaves the door open for China to take a lead in forging trade alliances. Remember, China isn't part of the TPP. There's been lots of talk recently about how China is promoting its own Pan-Pacific Trade Pact. It's called the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. The new Asian Free Trade Pact is still being negotiated, but if enacted, it could now become the world's biggest free trade bloc. It's different to the TPP because it does not require its members to take steps to liberalize their economies. They're also not required to protect labor rights, the environment, or intellectual property. And more countries are now looking to join its 16-member bloc so they can get their hands on the global supply chain without paying tariffs. With me now is Deborah Elms. She is the Executive Director at the Singapore-based Asian Trade Center. Thanks very much for being with us. So it does look like the TPP is all but dead. So focus is going to turn to China and the rival deal that it's pushing for. What implications is that going to have for the region as a whole? And is China going to allow access to its markets?
Well, I'm not sure that the TPP itself is dead. I think it's true that the United States is not moving forward with the agreement, but it's possible that the other 11 players in the TPP might continue to move forward with that agreement. So we have an interesting situation now where we may have both agreements moving ahead, one without the United States, but with the remaining members, but also the alternate agreement, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, also moving ahead in Asia. So we may have both agreements still live here on the ground in Asia.
Interesting that you say TPP is not dead because it, as we said, it doesn't look like the U.S. is going to ratify it, judging by what President-elect Donald Trump has said. Japan's Prime Minister Shinzo Abe has said the deal is meaningless without the U.S. So you have two of the biggest economies right there, essentially pouring cold water on this. So what chance does it have then?
Well, I think that the Japanese Prime Minister, when he made that remark, was, I think, reacting badly to news that Donald Trump, right after they had personally met, had then rejected the TPP. So I think once Abe and his administration sit back and reflect on what they get in the TPP, they may change their mind. They may say, wait a minute, we have already implemented the TPP domestically here in Japan, passed it through the lower house of the Diet, are moving it through the upper house in the Diet. We may actually be okay if we have the TPP with the remaining parties and allow the United States to come in at whatever distant point in the future should they choose to do so. I think on reflection, the Japanese may change their mind. We'll have to see. We're not sure. But I'm not convinced that the entire agreement is in fact dead just because the Americans are out. We'll have to see. But in the meantime, the counter agreement here in Asia, the RCEP, is still ongoing. Negotiations pick up next week, week and a half here in Jakarta for the RCEP negotiations.
Well, let's talk a little bit more about that trade deal, RCEP, because this is the one that China's been pushing. Mm-hmm. In what ways is that one different from TPP? It's not as comprehensive, for one thing, is it?
No. No, this is a different kind of agreement. In fact, what's interesting now is that that agreement is also very different in the wake of Donald Trump's announcement. Prior to that, China had not actually been leading that agreement. They were there, they were active, but they hadn't been driving it. Now, however, I think the Chinese will, in fact, take a leadership role on RCEP because they will say, wait a second, if the Americans are out of the trade game, then we really can, in fact, drive trade in globally, but certainly here in Asia, in a way that we hadn't been able to before. We will seize this opportunity and we will drive trade in a way that we hadn't been able to prior to the U.S. sitting on the sidelines. This is a very different dynamic here in Asia, and I think all kinds of things are now on the table that hadn't been there before.
So is the United States really missing out on big opportunities here?
Oh, absolutely. The United States, I think, has made a huge miscalculation, or at least Donald Trump has made a huge miscalculation by sitting out this trade agreement in TPP and by potentially putting itself on the sidelines and allowing Asia to move forward without the United States and allowing trade in general to move forward without U.S. leadership. I think this is going to be a real problem for the United States. But viewed from Asia, I think there are a lot of opportunities now to set the rules of the game here in Asia in different ways. We'll have to see how this plays out, but I think it's very interesting. All kinds of new scenarios that weren't possible are suddenly in the sort of realm of what if and what else. We hadn't thought about this as recently as, 3-4 weeks ago, all of a sudden are possible.
So what form do you think some of these possibilities will take? Because there's been some more focus now on bilateral trade deals, which have their own benefits for each of the countries involved. But when you step back and take a look at all of them, it is kind of a mess of overlapping deals, isn't it? It's not quite as clear cut.
No, the bilateral agreements are much harder to use, especially for companies. They don't match up with trade patterns today. Companies much prefer larger agreements, and I think especially what has happened is renewed momentum, particularly for RCEP, this 16-country agreement here in Asia. And I think now you really will see a much more renewed focus to drive RCEP to the finish line. There are 7 countries in Asia that are in both the TPP and in RCEP, including Japan, Singapore, Australia, New Zealand. Those 7 countries that are in both agreements, I think, will really focus on RCEP with potentially the Chinese, and will try to get this agreement in Asia done as quickly as possible, but also hopefully with high quality, so that we have an agreement in Asia that keeps the markets open, that keeps the market open in a way that helps companies, that shows that globalization is not dead, whatever the Americans may say to the contrary, perhaps whatever Europe says to the contrary, and shows that economic growth and development still has a role to play in bringing about jobs, prosperity, and so forth. And I think that's very interesting.
Deborah Elms, thanks very much for being with us.
Thank you very much.
In Australia, successive governments have supported free trade and open markets, but that long-standing position on foreign competition may now be changing. Andrew Thomas tells us why.
Rossi has been making boots in Australia since 1910. Even today, the 150,000 pairs of boots it produces each year are largely handmade. Of the 85 employees, some have been here their entire working lives.
31 years I've worked here. Very good team. We work together quite well. I know most of them. I know.
But Rossi is a rarity.
This is one of very few companies making shoes in Australia. Foreign competition makes manufacturing here tough.
These cars, also in Adelaide, will be some of the last made in Australia. Next year, all the country's remaining car factories will close. It's in that context that concern for Australia's manufacturing sector is high on the political agenda. Nick Xenophon has his own political party, which secured 4 seats in Parliament in July's election as a common-sense alternative promoting Australian-made manufacturing.
If being a protectionist is about protecting Australian jobs and the national interest in the context of fair trade deals, not free-for-all trade deals, then I'll happily wear that as a badge of honour.
As no party in Australia's Senate has a majority, Xenophon and others like him have a lot of influence over government policy. Earlier this year, this steelworks on which the town of Whyalla depends was in danger of going bust. Workers took big pay cuts, but it wasn't enough.
Almost everything this town has is built on the back of the steelworks, so for it to go would be devastating, absolutely devastating.
Political pressure has led the government to support the works financially to help attract a buyer.
The Commonwealth Government has provided us with a $50 million loan. The South Australian Government have also committed $50 million to the business that'll be provided to a purchaser, and they've also provided assistance around the environmental liabilities which the Whyalla Steelworks sits on.
Australia's government believes in free trade and free markets, but faced with their consequences, there are signs its ideological position may be shifting.
All right, still to come on Counting the Cost.
I'm Paul Brennan in Iceland in the midst of an unprecedented tourism boom. But can this small island cope with the pressure?
Now, the UK's decision to leave the European Union last June is proving to be an expensive one. It is now estimated that leaving the EU will cost Britain $280 million a week over the next 5 years. In his first budget since Brexit, UK Finance Minister Philip Hammond downgraded his 2017 economic forecast and said the national debt would grow. In fact, it will balloon to above 90% of GDP, and that will wipe out any savings made from not having to pay into the EU's budget. There's also a newly defined group in the UK, the JAMS, those households just about managing to make ends meet. And this was the budget that UK Prime Minister Theresa May promised would help them. Well, joining us now from Glasgow, Gregor Irwin, Chief Economist at the Global Council. Thanks very much for being with us. So from this autumn statement the Chancellor delivered this week, we're looking at a $150 billion black hole in the UK economy from Brexit, higher inflation, lower tax revenues and higher borrowing costs for the government. It all looks pretty grim, doesn't it?
Well, that's a pretty good description of the rather bleak news in the Chancellor's autumn statement yesterday. When you look at what's driving those numbers, there are two things really. One is the fiscal position was looking weaker going into the statements. Income tax receipts are down. The economy is beginning to slow somewhat. But about half of the damage is the Office of Budget Responsibility. The independent forecaster looking ahead and trying to anticipate what impact Brexit will have on the UK's fiscal position.
And what about the so-called JAM families, what the Prime Minister and the Chancellor have referred to as just about managing? Not much in it for them as well, is there? I mean, are they feeling disillusioned now after voting for Brexit?
Well, if you look at the more immediate impact of the Brexit vote on the UK's economic situation, there's not been a whole lot of impact on consumers, households so far. But there's one effect that's coming down the pipe and perhaps rather quickly, and that is the impact that inflation has on consumer incomes. And the autumn statement yesterday made clear that as inflation increases, because the value of sterling is lower and import prices rise, consumer incomes are going to fall. That means that those households that are just about managing are going to find that their incomes are being squeezed further. And it's not really the case that the Chancellor had much to say yesterday that is going to help those households. He has cut fuel duty a little, but beyond that, there wasn't really much in it for them.
But since that vote to leave the European Union in June, the UK economy's done surprisingly well up to now. It's true the pound is down, but the government revised its growth forecast for 2010 up slightly. But you're saying that things are going to get worse.
That's not what I'm saying. That's what the Office of Budget Responsibility, the UK's independent forecaster, is saying. It's also what other forecasters are saying. Look, when you look at the Brexit vote, nothing changed on the 24th of June. The UK's membership of the EU has continued since then. The real thing that has changed is expectations about what Britain's future relationship with Europe will look like. And if that's going to have an early impact, it will happen through confidence. Households appear to be relatively confident still about what Brexit means for them, at least for the moment. If you look at the impact on businesses, though, there are perhaps some signs that the economy is slowing rather more quickly. Business confidence is down, and certainly the forecast yesterday suggests that businesses are investing less. For the time being, businesses are in wait-and-see mode. They're putting off significant investment decisions, and we're going to see the impact of that more and more over the course of the next couple of years. If consumers also become less optimistic about the future and they start to spend less, then of course the impact on the economy will be all the more significant.
Well, let's talk about what this means then for the whole continent, because in the UK we're talking about the second biggest economy in Europe. What implications does this have for the rest of Europe?
Well, for the time being, there's very little sign that Brexit is having an economic impact on the rest of the European economy. But of course that can change over time, and it can happen in a couple of different ways. One is when you look at what the political impact of Brexit is, that is potentially quite significant. For now, we just don't know what the impact will be, but it's potentially quite significant. Certainly political leaders in the rest of Europe are worried about Brexit will mean for politics elsewhere. We've got a number of elections coming up in Europe over the course of the next 12 months. And if populist, non-mainstream parties do well in those elections, that could begin to impact on economic confidence elsewhere in the European Union. The second effect, of course, though, is what impact Brexit has on trade relationships between the UK and the rest of the European Union over time. But it's too early to say just how big a deal that is for the rest of Europe, because we're not there yet. It'll take several years for that negotiation to take place, and we just don't know yet what impact that will have on the rest of the EU.
Gregor Irwin, thanks for being with us.
You're very welcome.
Well, Britain's Prime Minister has warned business leaders that she expects them to pay more taxes and answer to the people once the UK leaves the European Union. Theresa May told the Confederation of British Industry that the public will expect businesses to behave differently in future. Lawrence Lee has more.
One of the most extraordinary effects of the Brexit vote has been to overturn the idea that a Conservative Prime Minister is naturally on the side of business. At this conference of people who, by and large, would have voted to remain in the European Union, there was a tangible nervousness at the perceived lack of a plan by the government to leave in a way that doesn't hurt them.
What happens the day after Brexit, when the clock strikes midnight and our 2 years negotiating time is up? Today, businesses are inevitably considering this cliff edge scenario, a sudden and overnight transformation in trading conditions.
The Prime Minister has already been accused of caving in to specific demands of the Nissan car company over the future of its factories in northern England, while not telling others what the deal involved. And yet here she came on stage, partly to offer reassurances to business that she understood their world, but mostly to remind them how things had changed, that they had to understand the mood of the working poor with whom they had a social contract. You make money and then you give some back.
For business, it means doing more to spread those benefits around the country, playing by the same rules as everyone else when it comes to tax and behaviour, and investing in Britain for the long term.
So hard hats on for business people not used to being told they have to change their behaviour, nor did many feel they got much detail to answer their concerns about a plan.
I never got that drive, you know, that somebody's going to say, this is what we're doing, this is how we're going to do it. I have to trust her. We have to trust her because she's our PM. So, and we've got a government here now that, I don't know, how do we do it?
Giving us such a positive...
Just like Donald Trump, Theresa May now claims to speak for the working poor better than her traditional, more left-wing opponents. Change is in the air, she said. We need to open our minds. Business is not used to this at all.
It all sounds much more economically progressive than the previous Conservative Party, which of course answered the collapse of the banks by imposing austerity on the people. It does remain to be seen, however, quite how the government would maintain or attract foreign investors if it expects them to pay as much tax as the general public does.
Iceland is known for its stunning landscapes and hot springs, but soon there could be no more room in its famous Blue Lagoon. That's because it is going through an unprecedented tourist boom, and Iceland's infrastructure is struggling to cope. Paul Brennan reports from Reykjavik.
The rich variety of Iceland's natural resources have turned the small Nordic island into a significant tourist destination. Tourism generates 34% of Iceland's foreign currency reserves, an estimated $3.8 billion in 2016. But the surging growth in tourism over the past 2 years also brings environmental and social costs. Iceland's dilemma involves balancing the need to rapidly and substantially improve its tourist infrastructure, while at the same time preserving the raw natural beauty of the landscape that those tourists have come such a long way to see. Analysis predicts that this island of 330,000 inhabitants will see more than 1.7 million tourist arrivals during 2016. And next year it's estimated nearly 2.4 million will visit. In 12 months, tourist numbers have risen more than 39%, but accommodation capacity has only increased by 26%. And 90% arrive through Keflavik Airport, concentrating the pressure of numbers in the southwest and Reykjavik. The mayor of Reykjavik is trying to find a balance. He's imposed a quota on new hotel space to preserve the character of the city centre. But in other matters, he says his hands are tied.
We think it's long overdue to define a city tax. So we have kind of better means to take the decisions needed, invest in the infrastructure needed, and kind of ensure a sustainable development of tourism in Iceland. And for that we need legislation from the parliament.
The silica-rich geothermal pools of the Blue Lagoon are one of Iceland's best-known attractions. It's expanding, opening 2 new lagoons this year, with an exclusive hotel resort due to open in 2017. And the managing director believes that Iceland's problem is not the numbers, it's the distribution.
We need to manage the growth better. We need to use the country better. We still have great opportunities, for example, in the north of the country. We need to have an international airport there and an infrastructure there. If we had those in place, we could double the numbers of tourists.
Another party of whale watchers heads out to sea, but back on shore, tour operators complain that taxes of up to 24% on ticket prices don't seem to result in investment in the industry which generated those revenues.
Though they're getting a lot of money from the taxes that the people that visit Iceland are paying in Iceland, they are actually not realizing exactly where it's coming from.
The challenge of managing Iceland's tourism economy will be high on the agenda of the new parliament, just elected at the end of October. The pressure is on.
So that's Iceland, the country. But now it looks like a cold war might be breaking out with the supermarket chain that bears the same name. The UK store specialises in frozen food and actually owns the European trademark for using the name Iceland. And now Iceland, the country, says it's taking legal action against the store. It's fighting for the right of Icelandic companies to use the word Iceland in relation to their goods and services. The company said it was not aware of its brand ever being confused with the country of Iceland and said it will vigorously defend its position. And that is our show for this week. But there's more for you online at aljazeera.com/CTC. That'll take you straight to our page, which has individual reports, links, and entire episodes for you to catch up on. You can also get in touch by tweeting me at Hazem Sika, and do use the hashtag AJCTC when you do, or drop us an email. countingthecost@aljazeera.net is our address. So that's it for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Hazem Sika from the whole team. Thanks for joining us. The news on Al Jazeera is next.